The potential for the Iran deal collapse and its implications. Just so you know, at the beginning, we are having some slight technical challenges. This event is not actually, we're not able to live stream it as we had originally planned. Okay. Is this on? Can you hear me? Thank you. I'll raise my voice. So did everyone catch that? Okay. So we're not able to live stream this. It will be posted immediately after we're done. That means, of course, we can't take questions from live tweeters simultaneously. But thank you all of you for being here, and we'll look forward to your questions for this event. Also, we have just a few mics, so we're going to share them amongst ourselves. Thank you for your patience as we do so during this event. So to offer a little bit of a backdrop for today's session, on October 15th, the President will face a deadline to make a certification or not to the U.S. Congress pursuant to a piece of 2015 legislation that Iran is in compliance with the nuclear deal, the 2015 nuclear deal. And that will set off a process and a set of decisions for the U.S. Congress and potentially for the administration. And we're going to talk about that today as a group and whether or not what that means for the nuclear deal. I'm sorry, hold on, can you take this for 1 second?
Of course.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. So the President has given every indication that he does not plan to make this certification, and he's said a number of very critical things about this nuclear deal. Our program today will examine, I'm sorry, 1 second, Peter. This set of circumstances. In this first panel, we're going to talk about, thank you, what it would mean technically to not make this certification. And in the second panel, we'll talk about some of the implications for U.S. security alliances and leverage more broadly. Let me remind you that this event is public and on the record, of course, while we're not live streaming it. In our first panel today, we have several guests here. Peter Harrell, a senior adjunct fellow with CNAS. Kate Bauer is a senior fellow with the Washington Institute. We have Richard Nephew, a senior research scholar with the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and of course our president here at CNAS, Richard Fontaine. So let's jump right in. Peter, can you talk us through what it would mean for the president to make this certification or not on October 15th? And then what that opens up for the Congress in terms of legal options with regard to sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank all of you for being with us here today, and thanks Liz and Ilan for putting these two panels together. So I'll just start by talking a little bit about technically what's going to happen or what may happen over the next couple of weeks. So as all of you know, because you're here, there's been a lot of debate, and as Liz said, about whether the President is going to certify or not certify Iranian compliance with the JCPOA. This question is a certification under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, or INARA, which Congress passed in 2015 to ensure that Congress had oversight over implementation of the JCPOA. And under the Act, every 90 days, the President has to certify that Iran is complying with its obligations under the nuclear deal and continued sanctions waivers and U.S. participation in the deal is in the U.S. national interest. Obviously, former President Obama certified every 90 days last year in 2016, and President Trump has certified the deal or certified Iranian compliance twice already in the spring and then again in July. The next deadline for certification, and the reason we're all talking about this now, is October 15th that Trump has to certify. Now, if Trump does not certify under INARA, legally speaking, the non-certification does not by itself immediately affect U.S. sanctions laws. Instead, what it does is it opens a 60-day period where the leadership in the House and the Senate, so the Republican Democratic leader in each chamber, in both the House and the Senate, can introduce legislation to reimpose sanctions on Iran that were lifted as part of the JCPOA. And under INARA, that bill has to be considered under an expedited process. So it would have to move fairly quickly through the chamber, through both chambers, and the bill would not be subject to a Senate filibuster. So it opens a window of 60 days where a simple majority of both the House and the Senate can vote to reimpose sanctions on Iran. I should say INARA authorizes but doesn't require Congress to act. Certainly legally speaking, Congress could simply sit on its hands and do nothing. Whether it chooses to act under INARA is fundamentally a sort of political and policy judgment on the part of Congress and not a legal judgment. The one final thing I would note is that the waiver, the president, the INARA vote does not prevent or require, well, the INARA vote, or Congress not acting, would not prevent the president from reimposing sanctions. The president has an independent authority to be able to reimpose sanctions without Congress acting. So you could see a scenario where Congress would sit on its hands and the president would choose to reimpose sanctions. Obviously, if Congress passes a bill requiring the president to reimpose sanctions and the president signs it, he would then have to reimpose sanctions.
So thanks for that. I really appreciate that first laydown. Can you talk a little bit more about what some of the discussion has been in Congress about what reimposition of sanctions could look like? Staying more focused on the technical from at this point now, I'm going to turn to Richard in a second to talk more about the politics of that in this after you're done.
Yeah. So under the law, and I should say there's a tiny bit of debate about what I'm gonna say, but my read, and I think the consensus read of most of the folks up on the Hill, is that under INARA, Congress could pick and choose which sanctions to reimpose on Iran, should Congress choose to act. So Congress could choose to reimpose, one or two of the sanctions that were suspended under the bill. It could, under the JCPOA, Congress could choose to reimpose half the sanctions that were suspended under the JCPOA, or Congress could choose to reimpose all of them. So if I think from a technical legal perspective, Congress really has quite a bit of discretion about what to reimpose, with one exception, which is an important exception, which is that how Congress proceeds with INARA and what the reimposition bill would look like is up to leadership. So it's really up to Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer in the Senate, and Majority Leader McCarthy and Minority Leader Pelosi in the House. So there's sort of going to be internal, I think, party discussions about how to proceed, and then leadership can decide whether to go with sort of none, some, or all. It's not that kind of any member of the House or Senate can push their particular legislative proposal on this.
So I think it's important to note, as you've already touched on, that reimposition of sanctions does not automatically or immediately have a bearing on the JCPOA. The certification, of course, is a requirement by a piece of congressional legislation. It was not part of any original negotiation of the JCPOA. But there's some debate, I would call it very active debate in Washington and elsewhere right now, about whether the United States would be seen as compliant with the nuclear deal if some or all sanctions are reimposed by Congress or the administration. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the JCPOA, not INARA, but the JCPOA, and the JCPOA, the U.S. undertook specific commitments around specific sanctions to lift. So if you read the JCPOA, the U.S. as well as European Union agreed to suspend a whole bunch of specific provisions, whether sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran or sanctions on oil sales or sanctions on building cars in Iran. And the U.S. and the European Union also agreed to remove several hundred named Iranian companies from sanctions lists. And so those are very detailed provisions in the JCPOA. I think that kind of whether, as you say, the U.S. certifies or not certifies under INARA, I don't think that really affects U.S. compliance or non-compliance, real or perceived, with the JCPOA. I mean, we've even had the Iranians come out and say they see this certification as kind of a U.S. political issue. That said, I think if the U.S. Congress or the U.S. executive branch actually reimposed sanctions on Iran that were specifically lifted under the JCPOA, you would see pretty wide agreement among both the Iranians and the European partners that we were in violation of our obligation, unless, of course, there's some kind of agreement that Iran has, in fact, violated its obligations under the deal. So I think that the reimposition of sanctions, by and large, if they're the sanctions that were specifically lifted under the deal, would be seen as a U.S. violation of the JCPOA.
Thank you for that. Okay, now I'm going to turn to Richard Fontaine at the end. We'll pass it down. So a number of people have said publicly, including advisors close to the president, that it is in the United States' strategic interest to stay in this deal, although it's distasteful to many, and a number of people in the U.S. policy community did not support it in 2015 when we saw it come into existence. How do the politics look on the Hill? And will members of Congress want to take up a piece of legislation to reimpose sanctions or reimpose some under a theory that that doesn't actually destroy the nuclear deal? We saw a cadre of, or a group of moderate Republicans and Democrats be real decision makers in whether Congress approved this agreement to begin with in 2015. Where do they go now?
I hate to say it depends, but in this case, I think it depends. And it depends on a few things. One, it depends on what the administration does in terms of, it has open to it at least two scenarios. One, it could say, it could not decline to certify that the deal is in the interests of the national security interests of the United States, or it could, as administration officials have also suggested, that Iran is not in compliance with the spirit of the agreement and therefore has actually violated the agreement itself. And I think that if it said the deal is not in the national security interest of the United States, but Iran is in, is in accordance with the terms of the agreement, then you may get a different outcome than if it came along and said, they're in. Well, certainly if they're in material breach, but even if they sort of hung their hat on this spirit of the agreement stuff. I mean, the politics of sanctions against Iran on the Hill is pretty straightforward. It's easy to sanction Iran on the Hill compared to doing almost anything else with legislation. And of course, during the Obama administration, it was the Obama administration pushing back and the Congress consistently sort of overruling the concerns expressed by the Obama administration in order to place sanctions into place. And then, of course, July, we had a new sanctions bill on Iran. So this can be done, and it's hard to imagine a world where the administration signals that, A, it's going to decline to certify, and B, it would like to see the reimposition of some or all sanctions, and the Congress not acting. I mean, if you think about this, at least from a Republican member standpoint, would you want to take a position against the imposition of Iran sanctions on the Hill only to see the president do it anyway? So you have the same policy outcome. You just have a very different political path to getting there, and it's one that, is not terribly attractive, particularly if you happen to be skeptical of Iran in the first place. So, I think the only way that there wouldn't be sanctions is if the reimposition of sanctions is if you get into this sort of world where the administration or the president doesn't certify but then signals to Congress that he actually doesn't want sanctions and commits himself not to putting sanctions in place. But I don't think we're there, and I don't know if we will be there. But I think that's how the politics of this are going to move. And, there's the provisions for the expedited legislation, and you only need 50 votes for that, assuming the vice president will be a tiebreaker and all this. But even if the majority leader in the House or the Senate doesn't want to move legislation, anyone can introduce legislation after that. And, Senator Cruz has already said we should abrogate the agreement and put in place all the sanctions. Now, that would be something subject to a filibuster, so you'd have a 60-vote threshold, but nevertheless, even if the leadership decided they didn't want to do this, that's not the end of the political show when it comes to the reimposition of sanctions if there's a certification that they are not in compliance.
So you've laid out a couple of factors here, which, although you started by saying it depends, it did sound to me like if we're in a situation where the president does not make this certification to Congress, in fact, it'll be very difficult for Congress not to act to reimpose sanctions. Maybe we can continue to debate that more. But let's just go with that scenario and say that Congress then does vote to reimpose sanctions in substantial part or in whole, these nuclear sanctions that were removed pursuant to or waived pursuant to the nuclear deal. In that scenario, so now Richard, nephew, let me turn to you. Thank you, Richard Fontaine. Imagine that scenario. So you spend a lot of time in government engaging with foreign counterparts, asking them to join the U.S. in imposition of these toughest multilateral sanctions on Iran, up to and including the real climax in 2012 and thereafter, to impose financial pressure and diplomatic pressure on Iran. If the United States does reimpose these sanctions, it will be doing so most likely unilaterally. What's that going to look like in terms of the economic pressure that the United States can bring to bear? And look back at your experience working with these international counterparts. What will that be like now for representatives of the administration engaging with current counterparts to talk about the future policy towards Iran?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on already one of the main challenges we're going to have, which is that the situation is going to be materially different. That back when we were doing this, every point from 2005, 2006, all the way up to 2013, we were having a conversation with our partners about a shared vision of a nuclear agreement with Iran. Now, there were differences about what would constitute an acceptable agreement, and those differences persisted all the way up until 2015. I mean, you could say even potentially up until July of 2015. But there was at least a common sense that we were doing these things because nuclear weapons in Iran was a bad thing, and that sanctions were a preferable way of exerting leverage over the Iranians than other potential options. And I think that if the United States goes alone, we are going to be already in an uphill struggle to define why we're doing this and what our acceptable outcome is going to be. And I think that's going to make things very difficult. It's also going to be made difficult because the rest of the world is pretty well satisfied with the terms of the JCPOA. I think that there are some countries out there that share even my concerns about what will happen when nuclear restrictions start to sunset in 10 to 15 years. But their vision is that we implement successfully this agreement and then consider what we can potentially do thereafter. So then really it's a question of, can we overrule skeptical governments and get their companies to cooperate nonetheless, which is, I think, part of the concept of folks who are suggesting that we should go it alone and use the power of the U.S. economy to our advantage. There are a number of difficulties with that, starting off with the fact that there are potential steps that could be taken in Europe and elsewhere to block the implementation of U.S. sanctions, or to at least raise the cost to their own companies if they were to try and comply with them, much less things like WTO suits and so forth. And even if you don't think about those more draconian responses, even the absence of a coherent script about what we're doing and why is going to make it just that much more easy for companies that are resistant to getting out of Iran, see the benefits and opportunities there, to try and do that. Because then they're not just pushing back, or rather, instead of having to push back against their own governments, the United States and others, they're only pushing back against the United States, which is a much easier lift now than it may have been back during the heart of the negotiations. So I think it's going to be, at best, a very difficult scenario. And the implementation on the flip side in terms of real pressure is going to be very messy. It's going to be very muddy, which doesn't say a lot of good things in terms of the ability to bring real pressure against Iran. But it also doesn't say much good things about Iran's ability to withstand that pressure and to absorb it. And I think that's the worst scenario that we'll get into is not enough pressure to force the Iranians to make concessions, but just enough pressure to make them say this agreement isn't working for us anymore and reconsider the nuclear restrictions that are still in place.
Let me follow up on two things you just said. You were talking about the interest in some foreign counterparts to block imposition of U.S. sanctions. Can you just describe a little bit more what you meant by that for people who may be uninitiated into the ways of Byzantine European? No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, for the EU's process on this and history of legislation there. And also, you called a compliance picture messy or muddy. We could also use the word uneven. And you put it in that unhappy middle place between true economic leverage, if I understood you correctly, true economic leverage and keeping Iran in the deal. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like in practice, that messy or muddy space, who is complying and who is not, and why?
Sure, happy to. So I think on the first question about European response, if put on your memory hats, and we go back to 1996 when the United States imposed sanctions that were secondary in nature according to an American official and extraterritorial in nature according to European governments. We told everyone around the world that you shouldn't be doing investments in Iran's oil and gas industry, and we set caps as to what was acceptable and what was not. And the immediate reaction from Europe was indignation and refusal to cooperate. It didn't help that we were doing this at the same time with respect to Libya, which was part of the same statute, and also imposing secondary sanctions, extraterritorial according to Europe, with respect to Cuba and helps Burton. So it was a constellation of irritants, I would say, that we were bringing to bear with regard to sanctions. And the EU response was to pass legislation that essentially said European companies are not permitted to comply with foreign sanctions if they conflict with European trade policy. Now, that was never well defined in terms of what the consequences are, which is a complication if you're a European official looking to make that work and actually force European companies to stay doing business with Iran if, in fact, that gets resurrected and used here. Moreover, it's kind of hard to prove that a withdrawal from Iran is connected to U.S. sanctions per se, as opposed to the environment doesn't look very nice in Iran today. But either way, I think there is an option for European officials to use. There's history for them to use, and there's potentially even legislation they could consider now to either toughen up the requirements on their own companies with respect to contracts and enforcement of them, or the consequences of having been seen as complying with U.S. requirements as opposed to European ones. And at a minimum, what that raises the specter of is no cooperation between the U.S. and EU in enforcing sanctions, which is problematic in its own right in terms of Europe, but also then contagion to other countries. Because one of the selling points that we had back in the 2005 to 2013 period was that this was a multilateral effort. It wasn't just something that was a diktat from Washington, but it was something that was a shared multilateral agenda that Brussels was helping us execute as well. It was very helpful in talking to the Japanese and South Korean governments, for example, with regard to financial sanctions in 2010. It was, in fact, one of the main arguments that we used when we made our trips to Tokyo and to Seoul. And I think to your second question, this is where uneven and messy compliance comes into being. I think even if you took aside all legal questions, there are simple strategic reasons and certainly economic reasons why some are going to potentially cooperate and some may not, being specific. You can imagine Japan and South Korea deciding to cooperate with U.S. sanctions with respect to Iran out of their concern with North Korea and out of concern that this administration would retaliate against Japan and South Korea for their non-cooperation with respect to Iran sanctions. And so to me, it's very easy to imagine Japanese and South Korean government officials saying, we're going to play along on the Iran piece because we need the United States with respect to North Korea. I don't think you're going to see that with regard to China. I think that in fact the incentive structure might work the other way, especially when you consider China's broader interests in a global One Belt One Road trade initiative that they're pursuing throughout Asia, and you can see a similar replication maybe with respect to Turkey and to India as well. So it's a little rough, but I could imagine perhaps 60 to 70% of international companies cooperating and complying with U.S. sanctions, but still losing 30 to 40%. And at that point, if we're talking about billions of dollars here, that is not anywhere near the level of pressure we had in 2013. It's much less than that. And it's potentially even a wasting asset, depending on how others react to noncompliance by other countries. If, for instance, the Japanese are cooperating and complying with U.S. oil sanctions, but they see that China is buying more and more barrels from the Iranians and potentially even at a discount, how long are the Japanese and the Koreans going to accept that kind of situation? So it's an inherently unstable and an inherently more complicated implementation environment, to say the least.
Thank you for that. The real question is, which are the 60%? Which entities are the 60%? Are they Iran's crude buyers? Are they some of them, et cetera? But we'll come back to some of this. Now, Kate, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit about some of the uses of sanctions or the ability that the United States has to advance its other interests with Iran aside from this nuclear portfolio. You've done a lot of work on counterterrorism and the use of sanctions for counterterrorism to advance counterterrorism interests. And so while U.S. sanctions authorities with regard to counterterrorism and Iran's support for terrorism are not directly linked to the Iran nuclear deal, the economic leverage that the United States uses in order to put in place these sanctions and to advance its interests on these sanctions is tied to the leverage it has tied up with the nuclear sanctions. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the set of sanctions in place on Iran with regard to its support for terrorism, U.S. sanctions in particular, and talk about the ability for the United States to advance its policy using on counterterrorism sanctions with regard to Iran in a scenario where there is the continuation of a deal and where in this scenario we've discussed, we come to a point in the not distant future where sanctions, nuclear sanctions on Iran are reimposed and the United States, pursuant to this muddy or uneven compliance situation, no longer has the same economic leverage with regard to Iran.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, of course, the scope of the deal was limited to the nuclear deal, to the nuclear activities. And Iran's activities, pursuit of development of its ballistic missile program, support for terrorism, human rights abuses, all of those activities fell outside of the scope of the agreement, and as such, the U.S. and its allies retained the ability to pressure Iran on those fronts, and in the U.S. specifically retained sanctions against Iran in those areas, and the EU and at the UN as well to a certain degree. So the U.S. has, since implementation of the JCPOA, continued to sanction Iran for on the ballistic missile front. Both it's taken action against illicit procurement networks, against companies involved in testing, supporting Iranian entities that have been newly designated that are involved in the testing and research and development of ballistic missiles. The U.S. has sanctioned Iran on the terrorism front for support provided to Hezbollah. Notably, there's been a sanction action against a Quds Force official who was operating in Lebanon within the last year, and that was the first action against a Quds Force official in Lebanon in a number of years to call out and remind everyone that the Quds Force continues to operate there and works with Hezbollah. One thing about the sanctions actions that have been taken since implementation is that they've also continued to highlight Iran's use of deceptive financial practices and other illicit behavior in order to engage in these activities and to evade the restrictions that remain in place against them. So I think that that's interesting that in the case of the Quds Force official who was designated in Lebanon, the Lebanese companies that were working on his behalf, the Treasury Department said were engaged in money laundering and that there were cash transactions that ranged in the millions. So these have been strong actions that have drawn attention to Iran's ongoing malign activity. There have not been follow-on actions by others, notably. Although, as I mentioned, the EU retains designations against a number of these entities. The IRGC, for example, remains sanctioned under EU authorities. Iran continues to have authorities that sanction Iranian individuals for human rights abuses, and a number of the ballistic missile entities. So the U.S. has taken action to extend those sanctions in the last year. For example, against subsidiaries of SHIG, which is an Iranian entity involved in the ballistic missile program. And the EU continues to have SHIG on their designations list, on their sanctions list. And so this is an area where I think that if you look inside the JCPOA, if you continue to see the Iran deal stay in place, you have opportunities to try to garner the support and rebuild a multilateral coalition to put pressure on Iran's non-nuclear activities. This is an area that I think that the Trump administration has highlighted as one of the areas where they have concerns about the agreement. But it'll be difficult to do in the atmosphere that Richard described, where you have possibly a transatlantic crisis and a disagreement and non-convergence of interests on how to proceed on the sanctions related to the nuclear program, the oil sanctions, and the banking sanctions. That would be a very difficult atmosphere to try to think that you could get action. With the continuation of the JCPOA, I think there is an opportunity to rebuild that coalition. It would take a kind of a long slog. It was not the pressure that was built on Iran leading up to the nuclear deal was not built up overnight. And within that context, U.S. unilateral actions are not without merit. Often the U.S. acts first, and then you have follow-on actions in order from other countries to build that pressure. So there are opportunities there, but there needs to be a narrative that the administration can put forward to say that this is about Iran's bad activity and to call attention to that bad activity and to try to galvanize the multilateral coalition around it.
So you've just given me a great setup for the next question. Thank you, Kate. That I want to ask to all of you. So building up this pressure to galvanize collective or multilateral activity to try and advance broader concerns with regard to Iran. And some of those may have to do with the nuclear arena, extending some of the safeguards and restrictions put into the nuclear agreement, or other what we could call regional concerns. So you were talking about ballistic missile concerns, as well as support for terrorism, human rights. Now, if we're looking out ahead at the next week and a half or 2 weeks, and at a scenario which seems likely at this point that the president will not make this certification to Congress, but not automatically trip up U.S. Participation in the nuclear deal, that creates this enormous amount of leverage with foreign counterparts and maybe Iran to keep in place a deal that is very important and significant to a broad community of international stakeholders, of course, primarily including those party to the JCPOA itself. What should the U.S. ask be in that situation? We haven't heard an articulation from the White House what that ask will be at this point of maximum leverage. In your view, and given some of these concerns you've discussed, what should it be? So let me hear from you all. If you were crafting this policy, what would you suggest the ask be of European counterparts, others, of Iran? And after that, I think what we'll do is open it up to questions from the audience, so you can questions, and we'll turn to open discussion after you've had a chance to respond.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. I think you're exactly right, Liz. That this is where is the most interesting place in this whole debate to be looking right now. I think that the question of leverage, you said there's a huge amount of leverage being built, but I think it's possible that there's that the kind of leverage the administration thinks it's built is not matched up with, at this point in the European context, with potentially what the Europeans are willing to offer. And so it's a question of bridging that, looking at that gap and seeing where the administration can articulate those asks that are things that the Europeans can do. And I think specifically within the context of non-nuclear activities, you can identify things the Europeans can do. As I mentioned, they continue to a number of entities remain designated where the U.S. has taken follow-on actions and Europe hasn't yet done that. And they could do those. And some of those could be done with minimal impact on Iran's commercial and diplomatic relationship with Iran, I believe. But will those sorts of things be enough? In the terrorism context, there's consensus that Iran and its proxies are playing a destabilizing role in the region. Can Europe in particular do more on Hezbollah, for example? That may not be a near-term sort of thing that they could do, but something that a conversation now could get started where there could be an action later. So those are just a couple of ideas.
Keep the microphone in. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, a couple of thoughts. I mean, in the nuclear space, there are a number of elements that one could, conceivably put on the table in terms of pushing for either a supplemental agreement or even material improvements in the existing JCPOA. I mean, I think people who've advocated this line of attack have described a number of them, whether they're dealing with nuclear sunsets or additional transparency available to the IAEA. I think the problem, though, with answering this question, I don't want to debate the question, but there is a problem conceptually with where we're departing here, which is if the conversation was about an imminent Iranian problem and provocation coming from Iran, you could imagine a number of places in which you could say, well, we're going to back out of the agreement unless we get satisfaction on this problem and additional problems, and problems that are potentially in the making. I think the environment is such, and certainly the reactions I've already heard from European and Asian governments is such that there is no incentive and there certainly is no interest in pushing the Iranians to do anything. All of the interest is in pushing the United States to do things. And I think this speaks to just the way in which the question has been put to all of them, which is either we get a better deal or we walk away from the existing one. And as I've said before, I think that we've essentially telegraphed all of our punches in this regard. So if we are going to use this point of leverage effectively, I think the administration needs to define an objective that won't be seen as an immediate renegotiation of the JCPOA, that the main JCPOA will remain in place for a considerable length of time, such that the Europeans and the Iranians can actually get their heads wrapped around what this in fact means, and without thinking that next week they're going to have yet another demand and a threat of decertification, or that the next time that we've got another sanctions waiver, we're going to try and pull the same stunt, which is, I think, is the problem with the way that we've organized this thus far. And the last thing I'll just say, just briefly, is it's important to also remember that we have faced this problem of us being seen as the difficult one in the past. At the beginning of the sanctions regime, back in 2005, this was an uphill struggle for folks like Stuart Levy because there was a lot of suspicion about what our final end goal was and what our intentions were with respect to Iran. And we were only able to leverage folks' interest in confronting the Iranians when we put on the table our good faith expression of interest in an agreement. And that came with the P5+1 original package of incentives back in May of 2006. And I think if you want to try and recreate the sanctions regime, you'll have to recapture some of that magic. And it's hard for me to conceive of us being able to do that at the same time we're threatening an agreement that, again, everyone else thinks is working.
In terms of what to use leverage, however acquired, for down the line, certainly within the parameters of the JCPOA, if you could get a supplementary agreement that dealt with either some of the smaller issues, like why does Iran get to retain any heavy water, and why does it get to evacuate heavy water outside the country, and issues on inspections, to the big enchilada, so to speak, which is the sunsets, which I think almost everybody agrees must be extended, if not abolished, at some point. Could you get into a process to at least begin the conversation about abolishing or extending the sunsets? Maybe. And then, of course, on the outside of the nuclear domain, having the Europeans designate Hezbollah as a terrorist group and so forth, things like that. But I think leverage is having something the other side wants, and the other side, being every other party to the agreement except us, actually does want the United States to remain in the agreement. So that is a source of leverage. Now, you could then have to calculate whether that is sufficient leverage to achieve any of the things I just laid out, or some other things that the administration might want. But nevertheless, it's a source of leverage. I don't think anything is going to be obtained between now and the date by which the president has to make a decision on certification. But if certification is sort of the warning shot that the president indeed may abrogate the deal or reimpose sanctions, then that lights a fuse in which I do think there is some leverage to push for something, whether it's a conversation about a supplementary deal, something outside the nuclear domain. You know, the odds that you would have to attribute to the success of that has to stem from the conversations that are happening behind closed doors with the Europeans and others. But I think in terms of the big picture, it's also not a good outcome to have built up all this leverage and then to just dissipate it all by saying, well, we just sort of saw the light and everything is fine and let's go back to the way we were.
Just to echo, some of the points others have made. I mean, I think within the deal, clearly you have, as Richard Fontaine said, some of the sort of smaller technical things about heavy water, and then you have the big kahuna of the sunsets. My personal view is our leverage on the sunsets would probably actually be greater later. I don't think anyone involved on the American side in negotiating this deal actually thought that 10 to 15 years from now, this deal would in fact sunset unless there was some change in Iran. I think there was always a view, as we all kind of agree on the outside, that at some point there will have to be a follow-on or a renegotiation, and the question becomes, are we better off trying to negotiate this now when we're a year and a half in, or would we be better off, in sort of year 7 or 8, trying to renegotiate some of those provisions? And my personal view is we'd actually be better off trying to renegotiate those in year 7 or 8, when I think we'd have an easier time building a kind of global coalition on the need to do so. I do think we have some leverage, might have some leverage now on some of the smaller elements of the deal, but I think that one is going to be hard. The sunsets are going to be hard to renegotiate now, because it would raise a lot of questions about U.S. good faith and what would be coming next, and sort of how this would play out going forward. Outside of the deal, in addition to getting the Europeans to crack down more on Hezbollah, which I think would be a very useful and important step, I do think that getting them to re-energize the campaign against the IRGC in a smart and sensible way would be a useful thing to do. Obviously, U.S. sanctions on the IRGC remain in place and are not lifted. We've seen the Trump administration do some designations in that space. We've not seen a lot of support for that out of Europe. And in the meantime, we have seen some of the deals signed between the West and Iran, signed with companies that at least have some IRGC linkages. I do think some smart pressure on the IRGC would probably be a valuable place to focus with the Europeans.
So I'll take this. Speaking of Europeans, our next panel features a couple of European voices. So you, I think, have given them something to think about and react to. Before that panel, we have about 25 minutes more time to have a discussion with all of you. If you have questions, you can let me know by raising your hand, and I will call on you. Please state your name. Kevin. There is a microphone. Yes, coming.
Okay, I guess I win. Henry Rome from Eurasia Group. Peter mentioned in the beginning, does INARA refer to reimposing some or all sanctions? And you can read it kind of both ways. You can read it with the fill in the blank, as you can choose which pieces of legislation, or you can read the second part of that sentence, which is, and by the way, all sanctions waivers are now prohibited. So you said that there's consensus that it's pick and choose. I'd be interested if you could spin that out a little bit, and whatever the rest of the panelists' view on this.
I think we'll also take one more question if you can, come on up with the microphone right here to Kevin, who is wearing a blue shirt, third row. Thank you.
But a very small. Yes, very tiny. Thank you for a terrific panel. And I guess you've been quick to make the distinction between decertification and the reinstatement of sanctions. But there are different periods, different cycle times for the many sanctions that must be waived. and there's not a tremendous amount of transparency in the public eye about when the next cycle time comes up. So could you perhaps calendar out in two different scenarios, one the Congress acts scenario, and how long that would make the fuse much shorter, in essence, for any sort of leverage. And then in the Congress doesn't act scenario, when Trump has to decide whether or not, as Richard Fontaine said, it's time to act or dissipate the leverage that's been raised. Thank you.
So happily, we have a deep bench of technical expertise to answer these questions. Why don't we take the INARA interpretation one first? Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think it actually said there was a little bit of debate on the issue. I guess this is, so the way INARA is structured, I don't mean to bore you all with detail, but there's sort of it says that a bill will be not subject to filibuster and will be subject to expedited consideration if it meets certain criteria. And one of the criteria is it says the bill shall be sort of, and then there's a fill in the blank, title to fill in the blank. And I just don't see any, maybe it's because I'm a sort of simple-minded lawyer, but I don't see any reason why they couldn't simply write in titles with sub-provisions and that suffice. Obviously, at some level, it would be up to the Senate parliamentarian to decide whether or not, in fact, a kind of convoluted, 17-line title with lots of subsections, in fact, met the terms. But I just suspect, given the way, certainly on the House side, where it's not up to the parliamentarian, it's up to leadership, and on the Senate for the filibuster, I just think where they'd come down is there's enough ambiguity in it that it's certainly reasonable to interpret it that way, and it's very hard for me to see the parliamentarian actually saying, no, this is, in fact, subject to a filibuster. So, yeah, there's a little bit of debate on that, but I think in the, practically speaking, odds are 99 to 1 that a partial reimposition would work within the INARA procedures. On the time frame issue, so some of the waivers, notably the oil waiver, the waiver and the oil sanctions, are on a 120-day cycle, and they were renewed basically right before the end of the Obama administration, then renewed in May, renewed again. I mean, so we've seen a couple of you can sort of clock that one on 120 days from call it. I don't think they ever did disclose the date of the final Obama renewal, but call it, the 18th or 19th of January. The others are on a 180-day time frame, including the banking sanctions are on a 180-day time frame. So those, were renewed, call it mid to late July 18th. There was a sanctions action, I believe, renewal would have happened there. So then we're looking again at sort of January for the next renewal of many of those big ticket items.
So on political timelines, yeah.
Well, I just want to come back in on the question of INARA and the interpretation issue, because I'm even more simple-minded since I'm not even a lawyer. But the way in which I read the text is kind of more similar to what you're suggesting, which is that the options to slice and dice up the statutes is not available, and that you do in fact have to reimpose. But the point I want to just sort of put a tack on here, I really think that in this town we're always looking for margins and ways in which we can slice things up a little bit more finely. Let's take ourselves out of Washington for a second. Let's go to Tokyo. Let's go to Beijing. Let's go to Brussels. If we start reimposing even a fraction of the sanctions that we had in place before, in which the JCPOA explicitly requires us to make waivers, we get all the same bad as if we had done all of them all at once, and we get none of the good, right, in terms of even a chance of trying to reimpose pressure. And so from that perspective, I think there may be technical legal ways in which you can potentially slice it up. But I don't want, personally, I don't want to leave any impression that that is going to be seen as a compromise gesture on the part of the United States, because I don't think it will be seen as a compromise gesture. The other thing I want to put a marker down too is, and on this, happy to be corrected if you think that I'm wrong up here, guys, but there are also questions still outstanding about if you don't certify, right, and then you recertify at a later point in time, what does that look like? What is required? What has to be reviewed by Congress? Is that considered a new agreement that has to go through the whole process over again? Because I was talking with folks up on the Hill, and there were at least a couple that said that actually might be required, because it's considered a new agreement. And then just imagine the scenario of having to repeat 2015 all over again. Perhaps. But I guess the only thing I just want to put down is I think that there is much less precision as to what exactly is required, much less precision about the timing. And then if we're trying to row backwards on this, I think it's a much murkier picture as to what that looks like and how that would be executed. And presumably, Congress can change its own laws, which is, you know, an option that's available to it. But doing that requires filibuster and all that stuff again.
Any note on the political timelines? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Not the political timelines, but I do want to complicate the picture just even a tiny bit more because, you know, we have disaggregated decertification from the reimposition of sanctions. But if the president chooses to, if he declines to certify that the deal is in the national interest of the United States, then on what basis would he continue to waive sanctions?
Right. Yes. Agreed.
National interest waiver, among other things.
Right. So taking off my moderator hat for a moment, I'm a person who believes that it's a legally untenable or extraordinarily difficult position to be in, to simultaneously say that, to make this, to not offer certification, and then to come to a point where the administration continues to waive the sanctions. It's it seems to me an irreconcilable legal problem. You'd have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to go both of those directions simultaneously legally.
Although if I were in the executive branch now, I would say get the most creative lawyers we got, get them out there, and have them put their thinking caps on about how to square the circle. But, so we'll see.
Kate, jump in, and then we'll take. Yeah.
I agree that I think it really depends. The reaction overseas depends a lot on how the decertification is done. And I think there are options, you know, of course, there are options in the legislation beyond just saying either it's not in the U.S. national security interest or Iran has, is in material breach. I think there's room there that could signal what kinds of things other actors could do to try to resolve. I mean, there's a lot of different permutations of how to do that, but I think that there is some space in the middle.
We'll take a couple more questions. We'll take several at a time. So could the microphone come to the middle aisle? We're going to take with the purple scarf and in the black.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, yep.
Thank you, Sharon White. I, at one point in the past, was at the IAEA delegation. I'd be interested in hearing a little more on your view on how this plays or what it suggests about the U.S. from a slightly different point of view, and also Iran. In Iran, for a long time, the hardliners were trying to deep six this, and, is this now going to, they can relax because they don't need to do much to achieve their ends, although you could make an argument it'll play the other way. But and in the U.S., does this reflect in any respect a different assessment of how important it is to keep Iran from getting nuclear weapons on a quicker timeline? Because it's a little hard for me to understand what we think we're achieving if you don't reassess the importance of that.
Thank you. And the other question?
Thanks. Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. So on July 7th, a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons was approved at the UN with 122 votes. And on September 20th, it came up for signatories and ratification. So if you have 50 ratifications, it comes into force in 90 days. So if that happens, how would that affect all this? And another hypothetical question is, do you think there's a chance that the deal could win the Nobel Peace Prize on Friday? I could imagine what Trump would say if it did. I think, anyway, what do you think, who would win, and what do you imagine that effect?
Good creative questions. Here, let's have Richard start. Thank you.
Which Richard? We should have been on opposite ends.
The Richards.
Terrible. I'll let the other Richard go in a second. I don't think the UN the action on nuclear weapons will have any effect at all. I mean, any more than it would. It's not like the P5 are reconsidering their possession of nuclear weapons as a result of what happened in the General Assembly. So I don't think that'll have any effect. On this issue of the hardliners versus the moderates, personally, I've concluded we should stop trying to aim for agreements that are going to game internal Iranian politics and hope for collateral benefits that way, because, you know, a lot of the, or at least some of President Obama's sort of offering of the deal was, well, this will empower the moderates at the expense of the hardliners, and who knows what possibilities this could open up down the line. And then, if anything, it seemed like the Supreme Leader said, well, I gave one to the moderates, now I got to help out the hardliners in order to sort of keep everything, you know, in equilibrium. And so it may, if anything, have had the opposite reaction or none whatsoever. And now we're saying, well, maybe if the deal goes away, the hardliners are empowered again, but Rouhani's president, so how does this all net out and everything? And I think we don't know. And so we should go to your other point, which is, what is our national security objective in all this? You know, I understand how we could get out of this, understand why we might want to get out of this, but the question is not a return to the status quo ante. The question is, what path will lead us to a non-nuclear Iran that is more reliable than the one we're on? And that is, I think, going back to the original question of what are sort of the Hill politics, that's the question that I hear so many people asking on the Hill is, okay, what's the plan? So we don't certify, and maybe we get rid of sanctions, or maybe we get some, but where do we go from here? Do we continue to bind the Iranians to their existing obligations? Do we think there's a reasonable chance that we can actually increase the obligations that they're under? And what is the path to do that? And that's the missing piece, I think, in this whole thing.
I tend to agree with that last comment in particular. I guess the only thought I would have on the hardliner balance is I very much agree that we shouldn't make decisions about what we should do based on the carom effect of internal politics. That said, I mean, you know, some of the predictions about what potentially could happen in Iran as a result of the JCPOA have started to come at least a little true with respect to, for instance, economic reforms being, you know, enabled by the fact that there has been some additional money coming in, and the argument being made within the system that it's easier for us to get investment into the country if we don't have IRGC companies attached to every single thing that we do. And, you know, when you look at some of the internal debates that have happened about banking compliance with the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, and you look at some of the discussions about IRGC involvement in the economy, which is part of the Iranian political campaign back in May, that to me makes me think at least that some of the positive ancillary benefits of the JCPOA are starting to show at least a little bit of fruit. But even assuming that's true, at the end of the day, the real reason why we did this was because of nuclear weapons concerns. I tend to think, maybe it's my own training in nonproliferation, that ought to remain our number one objective here, because a number of these other issues are, as unpleasant and distasteful as they are manageable in a way that Iranian nuclear weapons possession is not. And so from that perspective, I think that needs to remain our focus. And I think that's part of the reason why you are seeing people who are very hawkish on Iran who are stepping back and saying, yeah, but what does, in fact, happen next? And briefly, because I don't know if anybody else is going to say anything about the Nobel Prize thing, I won't bother to predict because I have absolutely no idea what they're going to do. But I will put this marker down. I actually hope that they don't get the Nobel Prize for a number of different reasons, one of which is that it actually will, I think, have a perverse incentive here in Washington. And I don't think that's helpful to anyone, frankly.
Thanks. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions in another round, after which you all can respond to them, and then I'll give you an opportunity to say the things that haven't yet come up and you feel we must know and that should be in the public discourse in this critical 2-week period right before an important national security decision on Iran. So can we have the microphone come back up the line? It will start here, black and white, and then these 2 questions in the front, and I'm going to add a quick one on at the end.
Hi, Laura Holgate, former U.S. Ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency. I'm surprised no one's mentioned the argument that was in a Politico article this morning that said that the Republicans do not want the blood on their hands of a renuclearizing Iran. What everyone thought about what Iran was aiming for in 2013, it's hard to imagine that in the case of a U.S. abrogation that they're not going to put pedal to the metal and move full speed ahead on a program based on what they have now. Now, granted, it'll take them longer to get there because of the deal that's already been happening, but that will be on this administration's watch. Who thinks that Congress wants to roger up for that?
And then up here.
Thank you. Hi, Adel Nazarian, Breitbart News, and a fellow at a think tank in India. Observer Research Foundation. I have a question regarding sanctions, actually. There has been some coverage in the media about dual U.S. and other nationality citizens who have been skirting sanctions and doing business with Iran, which benefits the Iranian regime. I'm just wondering if the Treasury Department or the State Department has been monitoring this, and if there's a mechanism in place to see, what can be done and how they're being brought to justice for this, in a short few words. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm Doug Samuelson. I'm president of InfoLogics Incorporated, a little R&D and consulting company in the D.C. suburbs. I'm wondering about the overlap between the formalities of this agreement and cyber. We need to know more about what Iran is actually doing. There are moves in both directions, both to learn about each other and to confuse each other. It seems to me that there are some cyber and communications and surveillance issues that are closely related to the agreement, although they're not in the text. Could you talk about that?
Thank you. And I'll add my last one, which is that we've had a largely U.S.-focused conversation about this certification and reimposition of sanctions, but at the UN level, what should happen from a technical perspective, and also give a little color on implications if the United States reimposes all of its nuclear sanctions, or some significant part of them. What does that then mean for the UN Security Council resolution that enshrined the JCPOA and that mechanism that is attendant to the deal itself, the JCPOA? In any order you want to take these? Yeah.
I'll take the sanctions question just very quickly. So for U.S. persons, for American citizens, including dual U.S. Iranian citizens or dual, U.S. French or whatever, by and large, U.S. citizens aren't allowed to do much business in Iran, despite the nuclear deal. And we do see both at the Treasury Department and OFAC, where there's an enforcement division, and also in U.S. attorneys' offices and Department of Justice, you do see sanctions enforcement. And no doubt, when they see press accounts of this type you mentioned, they will look to enforce. I will say, over at OFAC, there was about a 2-year hiring freeze across the board, and I think they got a little bit behind on enforcement cases because of bandwidth issues, and then they also, both at OFAC and at Department of Justice, tend to focus on, big cases where they think they're going to get mammoth fines against name brand companies. But no, they should, a person in that situation should be criminally or civilly prosecuted. Certainly the legal liability is there. And the enforcement officials are generally speaking independent enough. I would assume if they have the resources, they'd follow up on that kind of thing.
I'll take the cyber question. Iran has been more active in the cyber realm, and it's showing a preference for that. There are sanctions authorities outside that fall outside the scope of the nuclear deal, like most of them do on the non-nuclear activities, that can be brought to bear, and they have been in some context. There was, I believe it was just in July that the Trump administration sanctioned a network in Iran as a transnational criminal organization. It was a network that was hacking software and selling it to customers in Iran, including the government. So, and there was a DOJ action, I believe, an indictment at the same time of that network. So there are tools available to do that. They fall outside the scope of the deal, and so they can be brought to bear now and hopefully in the future as well.
And I'll tackle the UN one. Actually, this worked out with 4 questions. Yeah. Hey, man, you sat at the other end for a reason.
From my perspective.
So, look, on the UN, it's a really good question, in part because the UN Security Council action was kind of geared around the idea there would be a material breach. And so from that perspective, everything that was in the Security Council framework and the JCPOA framework was, I think, anticipating that Iran has done something nuclear that has not been resolved, or there is a question about them doing something nuclear that has not been resolved, like a question about access to a military facility or so forth. And so I don't think that there is inherently a connection between a not in national security interest finding for certification and snapback and UN Security Council action. Now, that's being a little too legalistic. Practically speaking, if the United States is snapping back its sanctions, right, Iran is not going to remain in the nuclear agreement for long in any scenario, I think. And I don't think that's a controversial statement to make. And I think that from that perspective, there very quickly will be a nuclear concern that would very quickly, therefore, be justifiable bringing up a Security Council resolution. And as folks are probably aware, that's on a 30-day fuse. So if we decide that we want to go to the Security Council, there's a bit of process about trying to prove within the Joint Commission why we've got a problem here. At the end of the day, we can short-circuit that process as well. You go to New York, you have 30 days, or it's rather up to 30 days for a resolution to be tabled. And the structure of the sanctions is that they basically remain in abeyance unless we veto a resolution that keeps them in abeyance. And from that perspective, we can do that on our own. So I think the UN Security Council angle in this scenario is probably secondary to the U.S. unilateral piece, but it comes fairly swiftly after the Iranians restart centrifuges and start denying inspector access beyond what's required under the safeguards agreement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, politics. If you ask the question, do Republicans want to have on their backs the possible destruction of the Iran nuclear deal, it depends on which Republicans you're talking about, the Republicans on Capitol Hill or the Republican in the White House. And what I mean by it is this, there is a distinction to be made between the politics of a particular vote that could or could not have policy implications and the policy implications that flow from it. So, they're linked, but they're separate. So, for example, when President Obama announced the Iran deal, he said, and I will veto any legislation that comes out of Capitol Hill that would undermine the deal itself or alter the terms or whatever the precise language was. By saying that, it signaled that as long as he could hold 1/3 of the U.S. Senate, and remember the Democrats have almost half, but 1/3 of the U.S. Senate, then the deal would be in place without alteration. That made every Republican vote free because they could vote yes and the deal would be in place without alteration, or they could vote no and the deal would be in place without alteration. So the politics is able to subsume the policy because the policy outcome is going to be the same no matter what. In this case, if the president came out along the lines of what Ambassador Haley said in her speech, Congress, it really is up to you. We're not going to decide. We're just going to certify or not certify, and you decide where this goes. Then every vote has a very specific policy outcome and an ongoing responsibility thereafter. On the other hand, if the president says this is the worst deal in history, Congress can decide what it wants to do, but I'm imposing those sanctions anyway. Well, then the policy outcome remains the same whether you vote for sanctions or vote against sanctions. And so the politics then, I think, takes over the policy outcome. So again, this gets back to, I think, my original point of it depends. It depends on what signal Capitol Hill is getting from the White House.
Thank you. Okay, before I give you the chance to give your parting shots, everyone, I'm going to give you a question to which you can respond or you can say what you'd like. So it gives you total freedom here, but in seriousness, the political discourse that we've seen really favors, it takes two particular focus areas on the deal. There's either a preference for a better deal, may this be the opportunity to get there, or maintenance of the current deal. There's not a major mainstream constituency arguing for no deal at all. So if that's the case, and there's this decision point that we've all discussed from elaborate legal and political constituency perspectives, what's the path forward here? And what would you suggest in order to achieve one of these two outcomes?
Easy final question. I think the president has generated some leverage. How significant it is and what it can be converted to remains something that needs to be tested. I would recommend that the administration not just dissipate it without having gotten anything. what I think would be optimal is if you get a supplementary deal that enshrines the current deal but lifts the sunsets, and you could deal with the other issues if you could. And if there's any possibility of getting that before year 7 and sort of hoping for the best and year 7 rolls around and roll the dice then that would be worth doing. But whether that is possible turns on what kind of conversations, a judgment of where the other non-Iranian partners are. So I just can't answer. That's possible. I can't answer whether that's probable. But certainly walking away from the deal and replacing it with nothing but having relieved Iran of its ongoing non-proliferation obligations from our perspective, having already handed it significant sanctions relief, to me seems to take us backwards rather than forwards.
Yeah, I'll answer the question, but I'll answer it in a slightly devious way. I think the real problem, to be honest, is the amount of public exclamations we've had on the subject. If the Trump administration had taken office and had a quiet conversation, not in front of the media, not even talking about it, about, hey, we campaigned against this agreement and we don't like it at all. We recognize that you do, and we have material improvements that we want to see made in it. We're not going to talk about this in public, but you are in a short fuse with us to have a private conversation about what else we're going to do. To me, I think the Iranians still say no. But if you're asking about what is that potential option here to do something, that to me was the chance. Now, if, for instance, Trump were to certify the agreement now in October and then go radio silent or relatively radio silent on the subject for some length of time and allow things to go forward, he may be able to get back into that conversation with the Iranians. Because in my experience, and it might be confirmation bias here, the Iranians are prepared to help us solve our problems, and as long as they're getting their problems solved too, such that but only if we do not have that conversation out in public where they feel a need to respond to the great Satan that's threatening and bullying them. And so I think that, to me, is the one point I wanted to end here with from my own reflections. We've talked a lot about what's happening in Washington. We've talked a lot about what's happening in Europe. But we can't forget the fact that even if we were able to reconstitute the pressure campaign, even if we were able to get European, Japanese, and Russian, and Chinese, and Indian governments all together on this, I don't think we should exclude the possibility that the Iranians just simply say no, as they did for a very long time, and go back to what they consider to be, their concept of economy of resistance and kind of buttoning up, and then pursuing their nuclear program with an eye towards either making us negotiate against 50,000 centrifuges down the road and a reconstituted Iraq reactor and all the things that come with, or then they wait us out the same way I think they believe the Indians and the Pakistanis waited us out with their nuclear weapons programs back in the late 1990s. And I think that is, to me, the big threat that we have here is that that even assumes that we're able to reconstitute that pressure campaign, which again, as we've already said, I don't think is likely.
Okay, so I think that Richard, on your point about could there be some sort of negotiation down the line, I think it's just important to note that if the deal was reopened, and this isn't directly against what you said, but the Iranians would want something, and I think that's what leverage have we built vis-a-vis Iran at this point that we have to trade away, and we do not, the pressure campaign is not where it was. And so looking for not a better deal, but the same deal and supplementary, do we have the leverage to do that? I think if you look at the kind of concerns the administration or complaints the administration has articulated about the deal, there are ways to address a number of those. Whether it's the sunset or inspections of military sites, they're a way to have conversations on these. In terms of the regional behavior and trying to use the non-nuclear sanctions that remain in place, I think there's the ability to rebuild that coalition as well, but it's not going to be fast. I think there is some leverage to ask the Europeans in particular to look at Hezbollah and to look at the way that Iran supports its proxies, the way that it resources its proxies, how does it get fighters and money and arms to its proxies? Can Europe help in disrupting that? I think there are conversations to be had on that in all of those areas.
So I guess what I'd say on the sort of take the question, picking up on some of the things Richard Nephew said about the public rhetoric and the rest. I mean, look, I actually think that there is some chance that decertifying and renegotiating actually works out. I can't say now it won't work out. To me, it's kind of like betting your retirement savings on at the roulette table at coming up 17. That might actually be the best decision you've ever made, but in 97% of the time, it's not. And I'm particularly skeptical about it, given, frankly, not just the rhetoric we've seen out of this president, but the way in which his own, on different issues, whether it's North Korea or health care or other issues, his own cabinet doesn't seem to be on the same page as the president. And so I really worry that even if, Tillerson and Mattis and some of these guys could, by going quiet and very carefully working things out with the Europeans, working things out, behind the scenes with the Iranians, that, practically speaking, that'll all get blown up, 2 or 3 months into it. And so I frankly see this as a very high risk proposition that we are about to embark on. And meanwhile, I will say on these other issues, whether it is terrorism or ballistic missiles, we have yet to see a coherent series of steps out of this administration how to address those. Now, maybe they're kind of waiting, we want it all linked, but, for the last 7 or 8 months, there have been various things this administration could do, including over the last 2. There was a new piece of Iran sanctions legislation that passed at the end of July. We've not seen an implementing executive order. We've not seen designations under that executive order. And I'd feel a lot more confident if, we saw this administration kind of already working to execute, in a proactive and smart way on things we all agree about, whereas they seem to be kind of, betting the retirement savings on 17. And that's really what worries me over the next couple of months.
On that note, thank you. Let me tell you all here, we're going to move directly into our second panel, so please keep your seats while we make a quick change in the chairs up here. But before we get up, please join me in thanking our panel with a round of applause.